My whole life has been the story of a man shaped by guilt and absence. That's what I tell myself anyway. I'm 48 years old, and I've learned to function with this invisible weight, the way other people might learn to live with chronic pain. You adjust, you develop workarounds, you learn which movements don't aggravate it. You learn how to smile even though something essential is broken on the inside. For 30 years I've carried that weight, ever since a summer afternoon when I was 19 years old and someone died because I wasn't paying attention. I never thought it would get heavier, but 3 days ago it did. Everything changed. I got a text message at 2 a.m, and my entire understanding of what I thought I knew shifted on its axis in a way that I still haven't fully processed. This is the story of what happened, and it starts with a message I never expected to receive. It's a story about guilt and loss, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I've been wrong about something fundamental all these years. So I'm going to tell you what happened, from the beginning, because I think you need to understand the weight I've been carrying to understand why that message hit me so hard. The phone buzzed next to me in the darkness. I was awake already, as I usually am at that hour, my brain running through the same loops it always does at night when I'm alone with my thoughts. Sleep hasn't come easy in about 20 years. The insomnia isn't clinical or anything, nothing that required diagnosis. It's just what happens when your mind won't let you rest. When there's always something it wants to process, some moment it wants to revisit, some decision it wants to second guess. So I was already staring at the ceiling when the phone buzzed. I picked it up more out of habit than anything else. The screen lit up my face in that cold blue way phone screens do. Unknown number. I almost didn't open it. Usually when you get a text from an unknown number at 2 a.m, it's one of two things. Either it's spam about your car warranty, or it's someone who dialed the wrong number and they're confused. This was neither. I read the message once and my heart stopped. I read it again. The words seemed to shift on the screen, rearranging themselves, refusing to stay in any order that made sense. We found a woman claiming she's been waiting for you. You need to come before it's too late. My hands started shaking. I could feel my pulse in my throat, that hot rush of adrenaline flooding my system. I sat up in bed, turned on the light, and read it 3 more times. The message wasn't changing. Those words were real. They were there on my screen and they were addressed to me. A woman, waiting. Something about the phrasing made my skin go cold. Nobody talks like that unless they know something, unless they're trying to tell you something that they think you'll understand. My name is Michael. I'm a project manager at a construction firm in a mid-sized city, about 3 states away from where I grew up. I have an apartment that I keep clean, but not too clean. I have a car that runs and a bank account that's reasonably stable. I have colleagues who think I'm competent and quiet. I have a doctor that I see once a year. I have a dentist and an optometrist and all the other trappings of a functional adult life. What I don't have is the ability to connect with people in any meaningful way. I've learned to fake it well enough. Small talk, professional courtesy, the occasional social gathering where I show up and disappear into the background. I've had 3 serious relationships over the years and not one of them lasted because they eventually figured out what I was. Not a bad person, not cruel or abusive or any of the things that usually end relationships. Just absent, emotionally unavailable, always holding something back. Distant. And the reason I'm that way is because of Sarah. My sister was 16 when she died. I was 19. She had blonde hair like our mum, this kind of mousy golden blonde that would have gotten prettier as she got older. She was tall and skinny in that awkward way that teenage girls are, all elbows and knees and self-consciousness. She played violin in the school orchestra and was actually pretty good. She wanted to study music in college, maybe teach. She had a best friend named Melissa and they did everything together. She was the kind of kid who was genuinely nice, not in that fake way that some kids are, but actually kind. She would help my mom with the dishes without being asked. She would remember things people said and follow up on them later. She was, in every way, a better person than her older brother. The drowning happened on a Tuesday in June. It was the kind of day that seems impossible for anything bad to happen, which is probably why I wasn't paying better attention. Clear blue sky, warm sun, the kind of heat that makes you want to be outside. My mum had asked me to watch Sarah that day. "Watch your sister, Michael. She's going to the lake with Melissa and some friends. I need you to pick her up at 5. Don't be late." I said, "Okay, sure, no problem." I was 19 and I had a job at a grocery store that afternoon stocking shelves. And honestly, I wasn't thrilled about having to cut my day short to go pick her up. I remember thinking that she could probably get a ride from someone else. Melissa's mum, one of the other parents. I remember thinking that I didn't need to be there, that Sarah was old enough to figure it out. I was an idiot. She asked me if she could go. This was earlier that morning. I was still in bed and she came in and sat on the edge of my mattress and asked if it was okay if she went to the lake with Melissa and some friends from school. They were planning to swim and have a picnic. It was supposed to be a fun day. She was excited. I could see it in her face, this bright anticipatory excitement about a normal teenage summer day. I told her, sure, go ahead, just make sure Mum knows. I was still mostly asleep. I didn't think about it. That's what kills me. That's what keeps me up at night. I didn't think about it at all. The drowning itself happened in minutes. That's what everyone told me afterward. 1 minute she was swimming with her friends and the next she was gone. The story I pieced together from her friends and the lifeguard and the police report is this. She and Melissa had been playing in the water. There was a part of the lake where there were some rocks just beneath the surface, and apparently she didn't know about them or didn't see them. She went under hard, hit her head on one of the rocks, and the impact was enough to disorient her, or knock her unconscious. The accounts were contradictory. What was clear was that by the time anyone realised she was in trouble, it was too late. Melissa saw her go under and thought she'd come back up. When she didn't, Melissa started calling for her. The lifeguard saw the commotion and went in after her. He found her quickly, pulled her out of the water, and started doing CPR right there on the beach. But she'd been under too long. By the time the ambulance arrived, her pupils weren't responding. By the time they got her to the hospital, she was brain dead. My mum made the decision to take her off life support on Thursday morning. She'd been brain dead for 2 days. Sarah had been 16 years old. I remember getting the call. I was at work stocking shelves in the pasta aisle when my mum called me. I remember the sound of her voice, this panicked breathing quality to it. Michael, there's been an accident. Sarah's at the hospital. You need to come now. I remember the drive, how my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I remember getting to the hospital and seeing my mum in the waiting room, with this expression on her face that I'd never seen before, this kind of hollowed-out look. I remember her telling me what happened. The words not quite making sense. Sarah had drowned. She was in the ICU. They didn't think she was going to make it. I remember thinking that she was wrong, that this was a mistake, that Sarah was going to be fine because nothing like this happened to people in our neighbourhood. Nothing like this happened to 16-year-old girls who played violin and wanted to study music. But it did happen. And for the next 2 days, I sat in that hospital room and watched my sister die by inches. The machines kept her breathing, but she wasn't in there anymore. I could tell by looking at her face. There was nobody home. She was just a body at that point. My dad sat on one side of the bed and my mum sat on the other, and I stood in the corner because I couldn't bring myself to touch her. I couldn't bring myself to get closer. That's my shame. My sister was dying, and I stood in the corner like a coward. And when she was finally gone, when they turned off the machines and her heart stopped beating, I felt this strange mixture of relief and devastation. At least the waiting was over. At least I could stop holding my breath, waiting for bad news that I already knew was coming. I remember my mum looking at me with this expression that I'd never seen before and has never gone away. This look that said, "Why weren't you there? Why couldn't you have been there?" Because I was supposed to be watching her. That's what kept repeating in my head. I was supposed to pick her up at 5. I was supposed to make sure she got home safely. Instead, I was stocking shelves and thinking about how inconvenient it was to have to cut my shift short. I was supposed to be there and I wasn't, and now she was dead. The funeral was surreal. I remember walking into the church and seeing her in the casket and thinking that she looked too small. I remember people coming up to my mum and saying things like, she's in a better place now, and God needed another angel, and all the other meaningless platitudes that people say when they don't know what else to say. I stood there in a suit that didn't fit right and shook hands and accepted condolences and felt like I was watching myself from outside my body. This wasn't real. This was something that happened to other families, not to us. My parents fell apart after that. Not immediately. There was this strange period of about 3 months where we all kind of moved through the emotions together, united in shock and grief. But then something shifted. My dad started drinking more. My mum started sleeping more. They stopped talking to each other. They stopped talking to me. And I became this reminder of what they'd lost, this walking evidence of the fact that I had survived and Sarah hadn't. It wasn't anything they ever said out loud, but I could feel it. I could see it in the way my dad would look at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. This mixture of something I couldn't quite name. Resentment, disappointment, the knowledge that he was looking at the wrong child in the casket. Within a year they had separated. My dad moved out to an apartment across town. My mum and I rattled around in the house with Sarah's room still set up like she was coming home from camp. Her violin still on the shelf, her posters still on the walls, her clothes still in her closet. We didn't talk about her. We didn't talk about much of anything. I finished my senior year of high school, and then I left. I couldn't stay there anymore. I got into a college about 3 states away, and I left without looking back. My mum came to my high school graduation, but it felt obligatory. My dad didn't come at all. He sent a check. For the next 30 years, I built a life that kept me as far away from all of that as possible. I graduated college, got a job, moved to another city. I didn't go home for holidays. I called my mum on her birthday and on Christmas. My dad I called maybe once a year. We talked about safe things, the weather, his job, my job. Never about Sarah, never about that summer. It was like we'd all made an agreement, unspoken but absolute, that we wouldn't acknowledge what happened. We wouldn't talk about the sister and daughter who died because I wasn't paying attention. My mum died 8 years ago. Cancer. She'd been diagnosed a year before that, and she didn't tell me until she was already in treatment. I flew out to see her after she called me and told me. I remember walking into her house and barely recognizing it. She'd sold it, downsized to a smaller place. All the family photos were gone. There were no pictures of Sarah anywhere. It was like she'd tried to erase the evidence that any of us had ever existed. We sat in her living room and I told her I was sorry, that I wanted to help, that I wanted to be there for her. And she looked at me with this tired expression and said, "You can't help me, Michael. You can't be what I need." And that was all she said about it. For the rest of my visit, we talked about her doctors and her treatment plan and the people from her book club who'd been bringing her meals. We didn't talk about anything that mattered. When I left to go back to the airport, she hugged me at the door and I realized it might be the last time I saw her. And I also realized that I didn't actually know her anymore. I didn't know this woman who'd raised me. The years of distance had made us strangers. My dad still calls occasionally. We have brief, awkward conversations about his health and his golf game and the changes he's watching in the neighborhood where he still lives. He's starting to talk about his mortality. His doctor says his heart isn't great. He's starting to think about what comes next. And I listen to him talk about these things and I feel this terrible guilt because I know that when he dies, that will be the last piece of Sarah gone. My parents will be gone and there won't be anyone left who remembers her except me. And my memories are unreliable and fragmented and probably full of false details by now. It's been 30 years. How much do I actually remember? And how much have I filled in with things I imagine must have happened? That's the life I've built. A life of distance and absence. A life where I show up to work and do my job and go home and exist in this kind of numb grey space, where nothing hurts too much because I don't let myself feel anything too intensely. That's been my existence. Until that text came. Until those words appeared on my phone and suddenly the tightly sealed vault I'd been living in cracked open. I was lying in bed at 2 a.m. like I usually am, unable to sleep when I saw the message. I read it once and my breathing stopped. "We found a woman claiming she's been waiting for you. You need to come before it's too late." I must have read it 20 times over the next hour. I didn't sleep. I just lay there in the darkness and stared at those words and tried to figure out what they meant and who could have sent them. The number was unfamiliar. When I tried to call it back, the line rang and rang with no one answering. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted and terrified, and absolutely certain that someone was trying to tell me something about Sarah. I spent the next day like a man possessed. I couldn't focus at work. I called in sick and spent the entire day on my computer looking at old news articles from 30 years ago. There she was, my sister, frozen in time at 16. A picture from her school directory. She was wearing a blue sweater and she had this half smile on her face like she didn't quite know what to do with her face for photographs. "Local girl drowns in lake accident," the headline read. It was 3 paragraphs. 3 paragraphs for a life. I read every article I could find, printed some of them out, spread them across my desk like I was investigating a crime. I looked at the police report, which I had managed to get online through a records request site. Accidental drowning, no foul play, case closed. There was nothing. Gee there, nothing that would explain that text. Nothing that suggested anything other than exactly what I'd believed for 30 years. I read about the lifeguard who tried to save her. I read the names of her friends who were with her that day. Melissa was there, Tonya Jackson, Marcus Webb. They were all interviewed. They all confirmed the same basic story. She went under. It happened fast. Nobody could save her. That was it. That was the entire story. But that text had to mean something. Someone had to know something. And if this wasn't about Sarah directly, then who was this woman who was claiming to be waiting for me? That thought kept circling in my head. A woman. Not Sarah, but someone connected to her. Someone who knew what happened. Someone who had information about that day. I couldn't sleep that second night either. By the third day, I'd made a decision. I had to go back. I had to go to my hometown, to the lake where Sarah died, and I had to find out who sent that message and what they wanted from me. It was the only thing that made sense. It was the only option I had. I took time off work without explanation. My boss asked if everything was okay, and I just said I had a personal matter to attend to. He didn't press it. I went home and started packing. I threw clothes into a bag without much thought about what I was taking or how long I might be gone. Maybe a few days, maybe longer. I didn't know. I called my dad and almost told him I was coming, but something made me hold back. What would I say? "Hey Dad, I got a weird text and I'm driving out to investigate a 30-year-old tragedy." No, this was something I needed to do alone. I didn't want to involve him in whatever this was. I didn't want to see that look on his face again, that look that said he was disappointed by what I was, what I'd always been. I left early in the morning. The drive would take about 10 hours, heading north and east through the interstate system that crisscrosses the country. As I drove, I kept glancing at my phone, sitting in the cup holder next to me, as if the message might disappear or change or suddenly make sense. It didn't. Those words just kept staring back at me. "We found a woman claiming she's been waiting for you. You need to come before it's too late." Who sends something like that? Who talks like that? It felt almost theatrical, like something out of a mystery novel or a television show. But it was real. Someone had written those words and sent them to me for a reason. As the miles accumulated, I thought about Sarah constantly. I thought about that morning when she asked if she could go to the lake. I thought about how I'd barely been awake when I gave her permission. I thought about how easily it could have gone differently if I'd said no, if I'd insisted on going with her, if I'd actually done the thing my mum asked me to do and watched her. She'd be 31 now. She might have finished college, might be teaching music somewhere. She might have gotten married, had kids. My mum would have been a grandmother. Instead, there was just this hole, this absence that I'd spent 30 years learning to ignore. The landscape changed as I drove. The city where I'd built my life gave way to smaller towns and then highways through open country. The road took me through states I barely remembered from visits before Sarah died. Everything looked different now. Or maybe I looked at it differently. Everything felt surreal, like I was driving through a dream where the rules didn't apply and impossible things could happen. I was about 3 hours outside my hometown when I realized I had no plan. I was driving toward something, but I had no idea what I was driving toward. I had no plan for finding this person who'd sent the text. I had no plan for what I'd say to them, or how I'd ask them what they wanted. I just had this overwhelming sense of urgency. The message said I needed to come before it was too late. What did that mean? Was someone in danger? Was my dad okay? Had something happened to him? I called him from the car. He answered on the third ring, sounding confused. "Michael? It's pretty late, are you okay?" His voice sounded exactly like it always does. Tired, a little bit distant, guarded. I almost told him I was coming, but again something made me hold back. "Yeah, Dad, I'm fine, just checking in. How are you?" He told me he was fine, that he was about to watch the news and go to bed. He asked about my job, about whether I was eating right, the standard questions a parent asks when they don't really know how to talk to their child anymore. We talked for 2 minutes about nothing important, the weather in his town, a doctor's appointment he had coming up. Then I told him I loved him. I can't remember the last time I said that to him. He sounded surprised. "I love you too, son. Is everything okay?" There was this note of concern in his voice, like he was trying to figure out if I was in some kind of crisis. "Everything's fine," I lied. "I just wanted you to know that I love you, just wanted to say it." He paused for a long moment. "Well, that means a lot to me, Michael. I hope you know how much I care about you. I know we haven't always been close, especially since—" He trailed off. He couldn't bring himself to say it. Since Sarah died. since you were responsible for her death, since I couldn't look at you without remembering what we lost." He didn't say it, but we both heard it. "I know, Dad. I know." We hung up and I kept driving into the darkness, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my chest, wondering what I was driving toward and what I might find when I got there. The closer I got to my hometown, the more the memories started crowding in. There was the diner where my mum used to take us on Sunday afternoons. There was the school where I went to high school. There was the exit that led toward the lake where it all happened, where Sarah died, where I got on that highway and I hadn't been back in 30 years. My stomach felt tight. My mouth was dry. Part of me wanted to turn around and drive back home and pretend I'd never gotten that text. Part of me wanted to keep driving forever, but another part of me, the part that had been waiting for 30 years for something that might explain what happened, made me exit the highway and head toward my hometown, toward the lake, toward whatever was waiting for me there. My exit took me away from the highway and onto roads I hadn't driven in 30 years. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. That's what people say, and it's true. The town itself was maybe 3 square miles, and most of that was residential streets lined with houses that had been updated since I'd last been here. There was a new shopping centre off the main drag where the Walmart used to be. The old movie theatre was gone, turned into a tax preparation office, but underneath the superficial changes there was something that hadn't changed at all. There was something in the air itself, something about the way the streets were laid out, the way the trees had grown along the sidewalks. My body remembered this place even if my mind had tried to forget it. I drove through downtown and felt my chest tighten. There was the diner where my mum used to take us for ice cream on Saturday afternoons. There was the post office where my dad had gotten his mail for 40 years. There was the high school where I'd graduated, where Sarah had been just a sophomore when she died. I turned down Maple Street and found myself heading toward the residential neighbourhood where I'd grown up. The house looked different. My parents had painted it a pale blue sometime in the last 3 decades. There were new shutters. The trees in the front yard had gotten massive. For a moment I just sat in my car across the street and looked at it. This was the house where Sarah had asked me if she could go to the lake. This was the house where I'd been too sleepy to really think about what she was asking. This was the house where I'd lived for the first 19 years of my life and then abandoned. The lake itself was about 15 minutes away from town, out along a winding road that took you through some older neighbourhoods and then into the kind of wooded area that had always felt separate from the town proper. The lake in summer was crowded with people, but in the off-season it was almost empty. I had no idea what time of year it was when I arrived. Late fall, maybe, or early winter. Everything was grey and the trees were bare except for a few stubborn leaves that rattled in the wind. I could see the lake from the parking area, and it looked exactly like I remembered it. A decent-sized lake, maybe a mile across, clear enough on sunny days to see down several feet into the water. There was a sandy beach area that they maintained for the summer season. There were picnic tables and barbecue grills, though everything was closed up for the season now, chairs stacked and locked away. Beyond the beach area, extending out into the water, was a jetty made of rocks. That's where Sarah had been swimming that day. That's where she hit her head and went under and the lifeguard couldn't save her. The memories of that afternoon were strange to revisit in person, because they felt both sharper and more distant than they usually did. When I thought about them in my apartment late at night, I could almost see her there in the water. I could almost see Melissa panicking and screaming. Almost, but also not quite. 30 years and the exact details had faded into something that wasn't quite real anymore. I remembered this place from when I was younger, from times when my family had come here to swim or have picnics. But my most vivid memory, my only important memory of this place, was second-hand. It was the memory of hearing about what happened, not the memory of the thing itself. I hadn't been there that day. I'd been at work, stocking shelves, too annoyed about having to cut my shift short to pick up my sister, to actually think about her in any meaningful way. Now I was trying to reconstruct that afternoon from the stories other people had told me. The lifeguard's account, Melissa's account, the police report, my parents' grief. By the time I'd gotten to the hospital, she was already brain dead. By the time I'd seen her, she was just a body. I'd never actually seen Sarah in those moments when she was drowning. I'd never actually been present for the thing that had shaped the last 30 years of my life. I couldn't quite reconstruct what Sarah's voice sounded like anymore. I couldn't quite picture her face without looking at that old photograph. What I remembered most vividly was her asking me if she could go to the lake. That moment was crystal clear. The way she'd sat on my bed, the blue of her shirt, the way she was excited but also nervous, the way teenagers are when they're asking for permission for something they want badly. I remembered thinking that she should probably ask Mom instead. I remembered barely being awake. I remembered being more irritated than anything else, annoyed that my sleep was being interrupted. And that was the last real conversation I'd had with her. That was the last moment where she was a person to me instead of just an absence. The person who'd existed was becoming more myth than memory. The memories I had were overlapping now with the stories people had told me about what happened, until I wasn't sure anymore which pieces were actually from being there and which pieces were constructed from other people's narratives. This was what 30 years of absence did. It erased the specific textures of the past and left you with only the broad strokes. There was a small pavilion building near the beach that had a door with a lock on it, but the lock was old and there were windows I could peer through. I walked around the building looking for any sign of who might have contacted me. There was nothing. No note. No indication that anyone had been here specifically looking for me. I checked my phone again. The message was still there. We found a woman claiming she's been waiting for you. You need to come before it's too late. I tried the number again. It went to a generic voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What would I even say? I walked along the perimeter of the beach area, looking at the rocks and the water and the trees beyond. It was eerily quiet. Just me and the sound of wind through bare branches and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. I started noticing things that seemed off. There were fresh footprints in the sand, a lot of them, leading from the parking area toward the beach and then toward a wooded path that went deeper into the nature preserve that bordered the lake. That path hadn't been there when I was a kid. Or maybe it had been, and I'd just forgotten. The footprints were recent. Some of them looked like they'd been made in the last day or two. Someone had been here. Multiple someones. The park was supposed to be closed in the off-season. I'd seen the gate that said so when I pulled in, but the gate had been slightly ajar, and there were tyre tracks in the parking lot that looked fresh. Someone had been coming here regularly. I followed the footprints into the woods, not thinking about whether that was a smart idea, just following them. The path wound deeper into the trees, away from the water toward the far side of the preserve. I'd been walking maybe 5 minutes when I saw it. There was a structure back here, kind of old cabin or ranger station that I didn't remember being here before. It was small, maybe 12 feet by 16 feet, made of weathered wood that looked like it had been out here for a very long time. There was a window on one side and a door on the other. The door was closed but not locked. There was a small sign next to it, the kind you might see on a museum or historical site. It said, Preserve Office, 1974. So it had been here for almost 50 years, and I just never ventured this far into the woods when I was a kid. I stood in front of it for a long time before I pushed the door open. Inside the cabin, the air smelled like old paper, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Dust, maybe, or just the smell of a place that hadn't been inhabited regularly in a long time. But someone had been here, recently. There was a coffee mug on the desk with a residue at the bottom, brown and crusty. There were papers scattered across the surface, though they didn't seem to be in any particular organisation. Maps of the lake and the preserve. A visitor's log going back years. The pages were filled with signatures and dates and comments about wildlife sightings and weather conditions. I flipped through it out of curiosity and saw entries going back to 1975. The most recent entries were from the last few months. Someone had been maintaining this office. Someone had been coming here regularly. I looked at the computer. It was off, but the mousepad showed it had been used frequently. There were coffee rings on the desk, multiple ones, indicating repeated visits. This wasn't just a random place someone had stumbled upon. This was someone's headquarters. This was someone's private space. There was a filing cabinet against the far wall, locked. I looked around, and there didn't seem to be any indication of who was here or why they'd been here or what they wanted from me. But then I noticed something. There was a folder on the desk, a manila folder. My name was written on it in black marker. Michael. That was all. Just my first name. I picked it up with a trembling hand. Inside was a photograph. I almost dropped it. It was a picture of Sarah, but not a picture I'd ever seen before. It wasn't from her school directory or her yearbook. It was a recent photograph. The girl in the picture looked like she was in her mid-40s. She had the same blonde, mousy hair that Sarah had, but longer. She had the same face shape. She was wearing a blue sweater, the same kind of colour that Sarah had worn in her school photo. She was standing in front of the cabin I was standing in right now. The photograph looked like it had been taken in the last few weeks. Below the photograph was a note in handwriting I didn't recognise. It said, "I know what you've believed for 30 years. I know why you believe it, and I know it's wrong. My name is Sarah. I've been waiting for you to come back here since I heard you left. We need to talk. Come to the cabin at sunset tomorrow." Sorry. I sat down in the desk chair and tried to process what I was looking at. This wasn't possible. Sarah was dead. She'd drowned 30 years ago. I'd been to her funeral. I'd seen her in the casket. I'd watched them lower her into the ground. My parents had grieved her. My family had fallen apart because of her death. And yet here was a photograph of a woman who looked exactly like my sister. If my sister had aged 30 years. Here was a note saying her name was Sarah, and she'd been waiting for me. There was no rational explanation for this. The thoughts that started forming in my head were the kinds of thoughts that people have when they're on the verge of a mental breakdown. Maybe this was a scam. Maybe someone was using an old photograph of Sarah that they'd found somewhere and trying to manipulate me. Maybe I was hallucinating this. Maybe I'd had a stroke and I was lying in my apartment hallucinating this entire experience. Maybe I needed to find a hospital. But there was also another thought, a thought that felt simultaneously impossible and undeniable. What if she wasn't dead? What if, for some reason, she had lived? What if everyone was wrong about what happened that day at the lake? What if I had been wrong for 30 years? The cabin seemed to spin around me and I had to grip the desk chair to steady myself. I put my head between my knees and just breathed, in and out, in and out. Eventually the spinning stopped and I was able to sit up. The photograph was still there on the desk. The note was still there. They weren't going to disappear if I looked away. This was Hallie. Whatever this was, it was real. I left the cabin and drove into town and found a motel. It was the kind of place that looked like it had been built in the 1970s and hadn't been updated since. The woman at the desk asked me for a credit card and didn't ask many questions. She barely looked at me. I took a room on the second floor at the far end of the building. The room smelled like stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner. The walls were a pale yellow that had probably been white before decades of smoking had yellowed them. There was a television bolted to the dresser and a bed with a faded floral comforter. I didn't care. None of it mattered. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. I had the folder in my hands and I kept opening it and looking at the photograph and then closing it again. The resemblance was unmistakable, but it was also impossible. I stared at the face in the photograph until the pixels started to blur and I had to close my eyes. When I opened them again, I reached for my phone. I called my dad. He answered on the second ring again, sounding more alert this time. "Michael? It's late. Is everything okay?" He sounded worried. "Dad, I need to ask you something about Sarah, about what happened at the lake." There was a long silence. I could hear him breathing. "Michael, why are we talking about this now?" His voice had changed. It was wary. "Just answer the question. Do you know for certain that it was Sarah who drowned? Did you see her? Did you see the body yourself?" Another long silence. "No, I didn't see the body. I didn't want to. Your mother did. The hospital had to identify her. The funeral home handled everything else. Why are you asking this?" I could hear something in his voice. Fear, maybe, or recognition of something he didn't want to recognize. "Just wondering." "Thanks, Dad." I hung up before he could ask more questions. I lay back down on the bed and realized I wouldn't sleep tonight either. I had less than 24 hours until sunset. Less than 24 hours until I would stand face to face with a woman who claimed to be my sister. Less than 24 hours until I would either get an explanation that made sense of everything, or I would discover I was losing my mind. The next day I tried to occupy myself, but couldn't focus on anything. I drove around town in circles. I went to the library and sat at a computer and pulled up old newspaper articles again, as if reading them again would somehow change what they said. I went to the diner and sat in a booth and ordered coffee I didn't drink. I kept thinking about my dad on the phone, about the way his voice had changed when I asked if he'd seen the body. I kept thinking about my mum, who was dead now and couldn't answer any questions. I kept thinking about what it meant that my father had never actually seen my sister dead. He'd taken my mother's word for it. He'd taken the hospital's word for it. But he'd never actually looked at the corpse and confirmed for himself that it was Sarah. In 30 years, I'd built my entire emotional architecture on the assumption that my sister was dead. Now, suddenly, that seemed less certain. By the time late afternoon rolled around, I drove back to the lake. The sun was already getting lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The parking lot was empty except for my car. I sat there for a while, engine off, just staring at the trees. At 4:45, I got out of the car and began walking toward the wooded path. My heart was pounding in my chest so hard I thought I might be having a heart attack. I could feel my pulse in my throat. My hands were shaking. I followed the path the same way I had the day before, moving through the trees, my feet crunching on the dead leaves and branches scattered across the ground. The cabin came into view at around 5 o'clock. I stopped walking about 30 feet away and just looked at it. The light from the setting sun was hitting the wooden walls and making them glow like they were on fire. The door was closed. There was no sign of anyone being inside. I walked closer and stopped at the door. I could hear my own breathing, loud and ragged. I raised my hand to knock, but before I could, the door swung open. There was a woman standing in the doorway. She was wearing a blue sweater. She looked at me with an expression on her face that I couldn't quite read. Confusion, maybe, or recognition, or both. She had my mother's eyes. She had Sarah's face, aged but unmistakably Sarah's face. "Michael," she said, and her voice was the voice of a stranger and somehow also the most familiar thing I'd ever heard. "I can't believe you actually came." I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up. I was staring at her and trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I believed to be true about the world. She stepped back and gestured for me to come inside. I moved without really knowing I was moving, my body on autopilot while my mind tried to catch up with what was happening. Inside the cabin, there was a small living area with a couch and a fireplace. There was a kitchenette in the corner. There were books everywhere, stacked on shelves and piled on the floor. There were more maps, more photographs. She closed the door behind me and I heard the soft click of the lock. "You're probably wondering what's going on," she said. There was a slight tremor in her voice. "Yes," I managed to say. It came out as barely a whisper. "Sit down. Please. I have a lot to tell you and you're going to want to be sitting down when you hear it." I moved to the couch and sat. She remained standing, looking down at me. "My name is Sarah," she said. "I know that's impossible. I know what you've believed your entire adult life. But I'm standing right in front of you and I'm alive. And I have been alive this whole time." "That's impossible," I said. "You drowned. I was at your funeral. I saw you in the casket." She shook her head. "You saw someone in the casket. But it wasn't me. It was someone else. A girl about my age, same colouring, similar facial features. She had an ID on her that said her name was Sarah. That's all anyone checked. They didn't do a dental comparison. They didn't do DNA. They just took my identification at face value, and everyone believed what they wanted to believe. Why would you lie about something like that?" I asked. "Why would you leave? Why would you let everyone think you were dead?" She sat down in a chair across from me. "I didn't choose to leave, Michael, and I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I had to. Because something terrible happened at that lake and someone made a decision to protect me by making me disappear. And for 30 years I've been trying to figure out how to tell you the truth without destroying what was left of our family. But I've been watching you all this time. I've been here, in this town, living right under everyone's noses, and I couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't stand knowing that you've spent 30 years thinking you were responsible for my death, when the truth is so much more complicated than that." She stopped and looked at me carefully, as if trying to gauge how I was taking this. I still couldn't speak. I still couldn't process what she was telling me. My mind felt like it was moving in slow motion, trying to fit all of these new pieces into a puzzle that I thought I'd already completed decades ago. "There was a boy at the lake that day," she continued. "A boy named Derek. He was older. He was maybe 20. Melissa and I were talking to him and some of his friends. He was cute and he was paying attention to us and we liked that. We were 16. We wanted to feel grown up. He was interested in me, or at least that's what I thought. I went with him away from the group. We went to a more secluded part of the beach, away from the lifeguard. He got aggressive. He got very aggressive. I tried to leave, but he pushed me into the water." She paused, and I could see her taking a deep breath. Her hands were shaking slightly. "I hit my head on the rocks. I don't remember much after that, just pain and confusion and then nothing. But I didn't drown, Michael. When I woke up in the hospital, there was a man in my room. He said he was a friend of our family. He said his name was Richard and that he worked in law enforcement. He told me what had happened from what the other kids had reported. He told me that someone had been arrested, but that the case was complicated, and there would be a trial, and that my testimony would be crucial, and that it was going to be very difficult. He told me that he had a way to make it all go away if I was willing to cooperate. He said he could make sure that the boy never hurt anyone else. He said he could protect me from having to go through a trial, from having to relive what happened, be in a courtroom full of strangers, and all I had to do was agree to disappear, to take a new identity, to start over somewhere else, to let everyone think I was dead so that there couldn't be a trial, so that there couldn't be any testimony, so that everything would be resolved quietly. I didn't ask questions. I was 16 years old and I was in shock, and this man was offering me a way out of the nightmare that my life had become. I agreed to it. I agreed to disappear. I agreed to let everyone think I was dead. I agreed to take on a new name and a new identity and to never contact my family again. That was the deal. That was the price of my protection and my safety and my freedom from prosecution and trial and all of the things that Richard said would destroy me if I stayed. He made it sound so simple. He made it sound like the only way. He made it sound like if I didn't do it, if I didn't disappear, if I didn't take on a new life, then Derek would walk free. Then I would have to testify in open court. Then everyone would know what had happened to me. Then I would be the girl who got assaulted at the lake. That identity would follow me for the rest of my life. Richard made it sound merciful, like he was saving me from a worse fate. So I agreed. So I left. I left in the middle of the night without saying goodbye to my parents, without leaving a note, without any explanation. I just went with Richard to a place I'd never been and became someone I'd never been before. Richard had connections with some kind of organisation or network. I never fully understood what it was or how it worked, but they had fake documents, they had safe houses, they had a system for making people disappear that was so efficient and so well practiced that I realised later they must have done this before. I realised they must have disappeared other people. I realised that I wasn't the first person Richard had decided to make vanish. He took me to the city, to a house I'd never been before, with people I'd never met. They barely spoke to me. They gave me a new name. My new name was Jennifer Walsh. I thought it was a terrible name. I hated it immediately, but that was my name now. They gave me new papers. They told me to forget about my old life. They told me that if I ever contacted anyone from my past, if I ever tried to reach out to my family, if I ever tried to tell anyone the truth, it would all come undone. The boy who hurt me would go free, and I would be the one who was punished for lying about it. They told me that disappearing was the only way to keep him in prison, that my testimony, my absence, was what made the case airtight, that if I ever came through, our warden said I was alive, the case would fall apart and he would appeal and he would go free. They made it seem like it was my fault if he got out. They made it seem like I would be responsible. They made it seem like my silence was an act of justice. So I stayed disappeared. I stayed dead. I became Jennifer and I tried to forget that I'd ever been Sarah. I was 17 years old and I was alive, but everyone I'd ever known believed that I was dead. I was living a double life in a way that nobody should have to at that age. I grew up in that network. I got a job working retail. I got a small apartment in a part of town where nobody asked questions. I tried to build a life that felt normal, but nothing about it was normal. And the whole time I hated it. The whole time I was angry. The whole time I wondered what my family was doing. I wondered if my parents ever found peace. I wondered if they ever stopped grieving. I wondered if they had other children, if they tried to replace me with someone else. I wondered about you, Michael. I wondered if you ever forgave yourself. Because I knew you blamed yourself. I could tell from the way you weren't. At my funeral. The way you disappeared for so long after I died. The way you must have tortured yourself thinking about that last conversation on your bed when I asked if I could go to the lake. I followed your life from a distance. I had connections. People who could find information through channels I didn't fully understand. I knew when you got your first apartment because someone sent me a photo of you moving boxes into a place downtown. I knew when you got promoted at work because someone pulled your company directory and showed me your new job title. I knew when you went through your divorce because someone tracked a court record. I knew everything about you and you knew nothing about me. I watched you live. I watched you hurt. I watched you build a life and I watched you struggle. For 30 years I watched your life unfold and I couldn't tell you that I was alive. I couldn't reach out. I couldn't send you a letter or make a phone call or show up at your door. I couldn't give you the one thing that I knew you needed, which was to know that I had forgiven you for not taking me to the lake that day. I had forgiven you completely, but I could never tell you that. Because there was nothing to forgive. It wasn't your fault. It was never your fault. It was the fault of a man named Derek who couldn't control his urges and didn't care about who he hurt. It was the fault of a corrupt cop named Richard who decided that the best way to handle a sexual assault case was to make the victim disappear rather than actually prosecute the crime. It was the fault of a system that was so broken that it thought that was justice. It was the fault of everyone who let it happen. I lived in this town the whole time, Michael. Not far from where you grew up. Not far from where Mum and Dad lived. I lived here and raised myself and built a life in hiding. I worked at the library for 10 years under my assumed name, reshelving books and helping people find what they were looking for. I worked at the coffee shop on weekends, pouring coffee for people who had no idea who I really was. I took odd jobs doing data entry and inventory. I volunteered at the preserve office, which is where this cabin came from. That was my real work, my real purpose. This place became my sanctuary. It became the one place where I felt like I could be myself. I came here every day when I could. I read the visitor logs going back decades. I watched people come and go through this preserve, and I felt like I was connected to the world through them. And eventually I realized that I was tired of being dead. I was tired of living a lie. I was tired of not being Sarah. I was tired of pretending to be Jennifer. I was tired of watching my brother live a life of guilt over something that wasn't his fault. So I started trying to figure out how to contact you. I didn't know how. I didn't know what I would say. I didn't know if you'd even believe me, or if you'd think I was crazy. I didn't know if the truth would destroy you or save you, but I knew that I had to try. I knew that I couldn't keep this secret any longer, so I sent that message. And now you're here. You actually came. You believed the message enough to come back to this place, to this town you'd tried so hard to forget. You believed it enough to face your worst fears, and that means something to me. That means everything to me. That means you're still my brother, even after all this time. The truth about what happened at the lake wasn't just about Derek hurting me. It was about something much bigger. It was about a cop named Richard, who had connections to organised crime. I didn't know this at first. I only knew it when I started asking questions years later. Richard wasn't trying to protect me out of the goodness of his heart. He was trying to protect his own interests. Derek was the nephew of a crime boss. Derek's assault on me was becoming a problem for the crime organisation because it was drawing attention from the police. Richard's job was to make the problem go away. The way to do that was to make me go away. The way to make me go away was to stage my death, to create a victim who never testified, to make it look like I had drowned so that Derek could take the full vote, or something different, something cleaner, something that didn't involve questions about where I was or why I wasn't available to testify. It took me years to piece together how corrupt this whole thing was. It took me years of being in this network, of being underground, of listening to the people who ran the system that had consumed my life. I learned that Richard was just one part of a much larger machine. There were other cops involved. There were judges involved. There was a whole system built on making problems disappear. I learned that Derek's conviction on the assault charge was legitimate. He did hurt me. But the conviction itself was built on a foundation of lies and misdirection and corruption. The moment I disappeared, the moment they had my body, or rather the body of someone else wearing my identity, the moment they had that, everything shifted. They could claim that Derek had killed me. They could claim that he had drowned me at the lake. They could claim that he was a murderer, and Derek would have to prove that he wasn't, which he couldn't, because all the evidence pointed to him. But now, 30 years later, Derek has figured out that the only way he can prove his innocence is to prove that I never died. He has to prove that I'm alive. He has to prove that the entire foundation of his conviction is rotten, and he's right. It is. But the cost of him being right is that I have to come forward. I have to admit that I'm alive. I have to tell everyone that I've been living in hiding for 3 decades. I have to testify about what really happened. I have to make it clear that the man who really orchestrated this entire cover-up, the man who made me disappear, the man who corrupted the entire justice system to protect himself and the crime organisation he served, I have to make it clear that Richard is guilty of so much more than anyone knows, and that's terrifying, Michael. That's absolutely terrifying. Because Richard is still out there. Richard is still connected. Richard has spent 30 years building more power, more influence, more protection. And now that he knows I'm alive, now that he knows I'm a threat to everything he's built, he's decided that the solution is the same solution he chose 30 years ago. Make the problem disappear. Make me disappear. Permanently this time. So Derek's coming after me in the courts to prove his innocence, and Richard's coming after me in the streets to keep his secrets. I'm caught in the middle. I'm the only living evidence that Derek committed a crime. I'm also the only living evidence that Richard committed multiple crimes. I'm the only person who can destroy both of them. But to do that, I have to step out of hiding and become real again. Once I tell the truth, once I testify, Derek's lawyers will rip apart the entire case. They'll argue that all the evidence is tainted because I was supposedly dead. They might actually win. And if they do, if Derek walks free after 30 years in prison, he'll want revenge. He'll blame me for his lost decades. He'll want me dead. That's the reality of what I'm proposing. That's the costo of telling the truth. I lose my anonymity. I lose my safety. I gain the hatred of two very dangerous men. I know this is asking a lot of you, but I couldn't stay hidden anymore. I couldn't let a corrupt cop go unpunished, and I couldn't do it alone. I needed my brother. I needed you to be there when I stepped back into the world. I looked at Michael sitting on the couch in front of me, trying to process everything I'd just told him. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. I could see the moment when he understood what I was saying. I could see the moment when he realized that everything he believed for 30 years had been built on a lie, and I could see the moment when he made a decision. "What do you need me to do?" he asked quietly. Those were the words I'd been waiting for someone to say for 30 years. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "How is this possible?" But "What do you need me to do?" Because that was the only question that mattered. That was the only question that showed that he understood the magnitude of what we were about to do. "I need you to help me go to the police," I said. "I need you to help me tell them everything. I need you to help me start the process of undoing the lie that was created 30 years ago. I need you to help me become real again. I need you to help me do the right thing, even though it's going to destroy a lot of lives in the process." Michael stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkening forest outside. "I need to know something first," he said. "Was any of it real? Did you ever care about me at all? Or was I just another person to watch from a distance?" I felt my throat tighten. My eyes burned with tears I'd been holding back for decades. "You were the only real thing in my life for 30 years, I said. "You were the only person I thought about. You were the only person I wanted to reach out to. You were the only person who made staying dead worth it. Because as long as I was dead, as long as I was gone, as long as there was no Sarah, then you could eventually move on and build a life that wasn't defined by my absence. That was the only gift I could give you. That was the only way I could love you from a distance. But I can't do that anymore. I can't keep lying to you. And I'm sorry, Michael. I'm so incredibly sorry that I've let you believe something that wasn't true for your entire adult life. I'm sorry that I made you carry this guilt, this blame, this sense that you were responsible for my death when you had nothing to do with it. I'm sorry that I've been here, in this town, watching. You suffer, and I couldn't do anything to help you. But I'm here now. I'm real. I'm alive. I'm standing right in front of you, and I'm asking you to help me do the right thing, even though it's going to be the hardest thing either of us has ever done. It's going to hurt, it's going to destroy things we can't get back, but it's the only way forward." Michael turned around and looked at me for a long moment. His face was a mixture of so many emotions that I couldn't pass them all. Anger, confusion, relief, grief, love. All of it was there, written across his face like a map of everything we'd both been through. Then he walked over and pulled me into an embrace. I felt him shaking. I felt him crying against my shoulder. His body heaved with sobs that had probably been building for 30 years, waiting for something to release them. And for the first time in 30 years, I let myself feel like someone's sister instead of someone's ghost. I let myself feel loved. I let myself feel real. We spent the rest of that night planning. We sat on that old couch in the cabin and talked about what needed to happen next. We talked about the risks. We talked about the consequences. We talked about what it would mean to go public with this story. We decided that we would go to the police the next morning. We decided that I would make a full statement about what happened at the lake, about Derek, about Richard, about all of it. We decided that we would cooperate fully with the investigation and let the chips fall where they may. We knew that Derek would likely be released. His entire conviction was based on evidence that was now compromised by the knowledge that I was alive and had been hidden all along. We knew that Richard would likely be arrested on multiple charges. We knew that there would be a media frenzy and that our lives would never be private again. We knew that everything would change. We knew that our family's grief would become public spectacle. We knew that old wounds would be reopened. We knew that people would judge us for how we handled this. But we also knew that we had to do it. We had to tell the truth. We had to make it right. So we left the cabin in the early morning hours and drove to the police station in town. The sun was just coming up, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The town was starting to wake up. People were getting ready for their regular days, having no idea that everything was about to change. I hadn't been inside a police station in 30 years. I hadn't identified myself to any kind of authority in 30 years. I hadn't stood in front of a police officer and told them my real name in my entire adult life. I was terrified. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding. I could feel sweat forming on my forehead. Michael held my hand as we walked up to the desk. His grip was firm and reassuring. I could feel him trying to communicate through that grip that it was going to be okay, that I wasn't alone, that he was there with me. The officer on duty didn't recognize me. He had no reason to. To him, I was just another woman. I told him my name was Sarah and that I had information about a 30-year-old drowning case. His expression changed immediately. He got a detective. The detective got his supervisor. Before I knew it, I was in an interrogation room telling my entire story to people who looked like they thought I was either lying or insane. But I had evidence. I had pictures of myself over the years that showed age progression that matched the missing person photos from the case. I had documents that Richard had kept, things he'd bragged about showing me, proof of the fraud and the corruption. I had been preparing for this moment my whole life without even knowing it, so I told them everything, and once I started talking, I couldn't stop. It all came out. All the years of hiding, all the pain of watching my family grieve for a daughter who wasn't actually dead, all the guilt of knowing that Derek's conviction was built on a lie, all the anger at Richard for making me disappear. All of it came out in this small room with these detectives I'd never met before. By the time I finished, hours had passed, the sun was coming up. The detectives looked shocked. One of them looked angry. They told me that they were going to need to do a full investigation. They told me that they were going to need to bring in the provincial police. They told me that this was going to be a major case. They told me that I might need protection. And I realised, sitting there in that interrogation room, that I had finally done it. I'd finally stepped out of the lie. I'd finally become real, and there was no going back. Michael was waiting for me outside. He'd been sitting in the waiting area the whole time, waiting for me to finish. When I came out, he stood up and held me. And I let myself cry. I let myself grieve for all the years I'd lost. I let myself grieve for the person I could have been if Richard hadn't made me disappear. I let myself feel the weight of all the decisions that had been made for me, all the choices that had been stolen from me, all the life that had been taken from me. And then I let myself feel grateful. Grateful that I was still alive. Grateful that I had a brother who believed me and stood by me. Grateful that I had finally told the truth. The investigation took months. Derek's appeal was fast-tracked because of the new evidence. He was released 6 months later after his conviction was overturned. Richard was arrested on multiple charges including fraud, conspiracy, abuse of authority and evidence tampering. The media frenzy was everything I'd feared. Every newspaper in the country ran the story. Every news station covered it. Missing woman found alive after 30 years. Corruption and cover-up in cold case. Corrupt officer arrested in missing persons scandal. My face was everywhere. My story was everywhere. I went from being a ghost to being the most visible person in the world. But it was over. The truth was out. The lie had been exposed. The system that had been hiding this corruption for 30 years had finally been forced to confront it. And I could finally start the process of rebuilding my life as someone who was real. It took time. It took therapy. It took sitting in a room with a professional and learning how to process all of the trauma that I'd been suppressing for so long. It took learning how to be Sarah again, instead of the assumed name I'd been living under for 30 years. I had to learn who Sarah was at 46 years old, who she had become, what she wanted, what she needed. It took forgiving my parents for not fighting harder to find me, though they were both gone and couldn't hear my forgiveness. It took forgiving my dad for never actually looking at the body in the casket, for trusting the system instead of his own eyes. It took accepting that Derek was free and that there was nothing I could do about that. I had to live with the knowledge that the man who hurt me got out of prison because of the lie that was created to protect me. It took accepting that Richard had connections in prison and that my safety would always be an issue. I knew people who could come after me. I knew people who wanted to. I had to live with that every day. It took accepting that I would never have a normal life because my past would always define me. Everywhere I went, I was the Dulce, omen who came back from the dead. I was the victim whose case brought down a corrupt officer. I was the girl who changed everything. I would never just be Sarah. I would always be this story. But it also took accepting that I was alive, that I was here, that I mattered, that my life, even with all of its complications and trauma and grief, was worth living, that the truth, however painful, was still better than the lie. And that was enough. That had to be enough. Because anything less than that would mean that what happened at that lake, what Richard did to me, what the system did to me, all of it would have been for nothing. And I wouldn't let that happen. I wouldn't give them that power over me. I was going to survive this. I was going to rebuild. I was going to live. And maybe that was the real justice in the end. Not the conviction, not the release, not the arrest, but the fact that I was still here, that I had the chance to start over, that I had my brother back, that I got to be real again.